اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي آمين. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Mrs. Casewit. It's, mashallah, it reminds me of the hadith that when someone introduces you so kindly, you should first ask Allah for forgiveness and then pray for His help to live up to those very kind words. Everyone has been starting their presentations with anecdotes of their relation with Dr. Nasr, and I wanted to share one as well. When I was a graduate student here studying under Dr. Nasr, I took a graduate seminar on Islamic thought with him in which we were all required to deliver a presentation. And so I asked Dr. Nasr the following question. I said, I think the best presentation strategy for me is to go through your previous lectures, pull out all the optimal relevant quotes, and quote you verbatim. And as you can see by Dr. Nasr's eloquence, that really would have been the best strategy. He immediately replied to me, if you do that, you'll get an F. And so I wasn't sure whether he was joking, so I decided to paraphrase just to make it safe. So I'm going to use the same strategy today. And it's really quite difficult, actually. Here I am giving a talk on Islamic esotericism, or esotericism in science, and Dr. Nasr is the world's leading authority on esotericism in science. So I had a little bit of a panic attack this morning, wondering, what am I doing here? I should just ask Dr. Nasr to come up and continue his lecture from this morning. But I think there obviously needs to be some division of labor between the generations. And so I think really the purpose of our generation is to apply and extend the principles that Dr. Nasr so eloquently articulated this morning, and in a sense to popularize them. Because I know that in my education, that it was very damaging intellectually to me regarding the relationship between religion and science before I met Dr. Nasr. There was always the idea that either there's this battle between religion and science, or the typical narrative that we usually hear. Or at best, religion deals with ethics and God, and then you have this separate view of science dealing with its own, and the two just really don't have any conversation with one another. And that becomes very, very problematic for any Muslim. So I believe that it's essential that we transmit the principles that Dr. Nasr so eloquently articulated to our next generation, to our children. And so we, in a sense, bring what Dr. Nasr has articulated at the university level in his religion and science courses down to the high school, junior high school, and even elementary school levels. So in part of my discussion today, that's really what I would like to share with you. How it is, at least to some extent, I've attempted to bring some of these principles to bear for my own children, and how in the Cincinnati community we've tried to do that in our Islamic schools. And also I should point out that our esteemed chairperson, Jane Casewick, has recently completed a wonderful book on symbolism for children. And that's a beautiful example of the transmission of spiritual principles that Dr. Nasr spoke about yesterday. Tradition in that sense. And of course, Dr. Nasr has also written a Young Muslim's Guide to the Modern World, and we need to extend that to elementary and secondary grade levels. So he is literally the tip of the spear. So in the next 45 to 50 minutes, we can only get a taste of what that is about, but I hope we can at least do that. Now, I'm not going to be constantly saying, as Dr. Nasr said on such and such a date during this lecture and the rest of this presentation, because that would occupy a lot of time. So consider this to be a global footnote. And so with that full disclosure, I hope, Dr. Nasr, I don't get an F on this presentation. Oh, I've already passed. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Barakallahu feek. Now, to discuss the relationship between esotericism and science, we have to clear the ground of certain modern misconceptions about the science and define our terms clearly. I know that most of you here will already be familiar with the following definitions, but they're so important to everything that follows that we have to briefly go over these definitions just for the first few minutes. And so what do we mean by science? How do we define it? The word is derived from the Latin verb scire, which means to know, so it has to do with knowledge. And this is neutral with respect to religion. You know, we could have biology, astronomy, theology, a science of God, angelology, a science of angels. And so in principle, science would be organized knowledge, which can be about anything. But gradually the term science developed into a very particular way of understanding this process of knowing. And so modern science has come to mean an empirical or sensory means of knowing the material or physical world. And so to be a modern scientist is to assume, at least while you're on the job, that the only way to know anything truly is by using your physical senses. And that therefore the only thing that you can really know is matter, even supposing something else might exist. Now that definition of science is in stark contrast with the traditional Islamic view, in which the material world is only a tiny fragment of a much vaster reality. A reality we can come to know by studying the doctrines and following the practices of Islam, as Dr. Nasr alluded to this morning, the training of our whole being, not simply our mental faculty. And the same could apply to other religious traditions from a perennialist perspective. And this reflects itself in the Arabic word ilm, which still has the connotation of organized knowledge. Science is not limited in the same way as it is in modern English. And Wissenschaft in German has a less comprehensive meaning than ilm, but still broader than the modern word science in English. Science in French, broader than modern, but less than in modern English, but less than German. And finally, you get this most limited understanding of the word science in modern English. So science, etymologically, should really be understood as organized knowledge. Now, scientism is the claim that modern science, defined as empirical means of knowing the material world, has a monopoly on knowledge. So science is not scientism. But what are we taught in school? When we grow up in this country, obviously, the first thing we're taught from elementary school is the scientific method, as if that's the only way to knowledge, and therefore we're really being indoctrinated into scientism. But there's obviously a profound internal contradiction with scientism, which would be analogous to me saying to you there's no such thing as speech, to quote Fridtjof Schuon, and that is that it is impossible to know whether the only way to know anything truly is by using your physical senses, by using your physical senses. It's internally inconsistent. And so scientism is self-refuting. The assertion refutes itself if it's true and thereby proves that it's false. And so what does this imply for, what does this mean? That scientism isn't science, it's bad philosophy. And so it is scientism versus religion, not science versus religion. And in any conversation between religion and science, obviously philosophy is there as a silent third partner. And so scientism is really an ideological construction of science as an alternative worldview. And it seeks to supplant the religious view of the universe and reduce religion to ethics without a claim over the nature of reality. And that is something, of course, that's completely antithetical to the Islamic perspective. And so what are the principles of Islamic science? First of all, Tawheed, the principle of unity contained in the Shahada, that God, Allah, is the source of all truth and all reality. And so, having set those definitions, let's talk about what are the consequences of that for mathematics and mathematical archetypes. What does math symbolize? And let's begin with a little number story for children that we have in Egypt to integrate knowledge. Wahid huwa Rabbi. One, he is my Lord. Two, ithnan Baba wa Mama. Two is Baba and Mama. Thalatha humma ikhwati. Three are my siblings, and so on. And I want to unpack each one of these. There's levels of meaning, just as we would have in traditional Sufi poetry that can be read to children on one hand and they get one level of meaning. From Hafiz, for example, all the way to Dr. Nasr's reading of Hafiz, which is a completely a different level of meaning. And so this has levels of meaning that we'd like to unpack to illustrate or give a taste of what those mathematical archetypes mean and the symbolism of mathematics. So numbers as ayatullah, as signs or symbols of God, the metaphysical meaning of the number one. And in Arabic, it's so beautiful because it's expressed directly in the language itself. One is wahid in Arabic and is the principle of all numbers. You might say one is the mother of all numbers. All numbers are the projection of the number one. Now Allah, God, is al-wahid, the one, and the creator of all things. And it's explicitly expressed in the Quran. Allah is al-wahid. Everything comes from Allah and returns to Him. And this is expressed very beautifully in the following multiplication. If we take 1 times 1 is 1, 2 ones, 11 times 11 is 121, 111, 3 ones times 111 is 12321. You can break out your calculators if you like. 1,111 squared is 1234321. You can go all the way to the 9. 111,111,111 times squared is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun. The mathematical expression. And so it's very beautiful that mathematics really contains this remarkable metaphysics, if it's understood properly. And so how do we teach children such metaphysical principles? How can we express this to our children? Because our children are normally taught what educators now call the drill and kill method, where you're just designing things to pass these standardized exams, and numbers are taught in a purely quantitative fashion. There's no qualitative dimension to them. There's no symbolic meaning, no metaphysical meaning behind numbers. And that has catastrophic consequences, which we'll trace out shortly. So there's a need for number stories to illustrate their qualitative dimension, numbers with personality, so to speak, which is that wahid huwa Rabbi, and so forth and so on. And so we need to begin by teaching our children these stories. Then my 6-year-old daughter, I have a 6-year-old daughter, an 8-year-old son, and a 15-year-old daughter. My 6-year-old daughter has now learned addition. So she is able to immediately understand how 1 is the principle of all these other numbers. But she hasn't gotten to multiplication yet. So I can't show her that 1 times 1 is 1, 11 squared, and inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun, the multiplication. But my 8-year-old son has gotten to arithmetic. I'm sorry, has gotten to multiplication. And so I'm able to show that to him to express that. And so he understands that. So if we return at each point in the development of our children's education to these themes, that repetition and reinforcement and deepening plants this very firmly in their minds and hearts. And it's that type of organized effort to teach our children these principles at the appropriate stage of development that, in a sense, will create that holistic view. Now, 0 is a more complicated number. That's something not for 6 to 9-year-olds. We have to wait till they get a little bit older than that. But that also has a metaphysical meaning, as Dr. Nasr so beautifully expressed. I have to confess, I mean, I've sat in his religion and science course 4 times, 1 time for credit, 3 times for, just sitting it in, because he never repeats the same course twice. He always hits things from different angles. And so it's almost like you're getting a 360-degree view of the subject. And then in addition to that, he's taught it 3 times since I've graduated. Thankfully, I have friends who are students who are recording his lectures, so I have access to those. So each time I teach the religion and science course at Xavier, I go over that section 7 different times to get the complete view of things. And so 0 corresponds to the point geometrically. It's the no thing that generates everything. And so if we take the geometric point, and how do we write 0 in Arabic? It's a geometric point. So everything is so easy in Arabic. It's so beautiful. As Dr. Nasr once joked, he doesn't know what happened to the 0 that ate too many donuts and just kind of expanded. So, but if you take the point and extend it, you get the line. If you take the line and expand that, you get the plane. If you take the plane and extend that, you get 3-dimensional space. So the geometric point is the no thing that generates everything. And the mathematical 0 really comes out from the metaphysical understanding of 0 as the essence of God, that 0 stands above all numbers. And so it is like the essence. And it's so interesting. In Arabic, al-wahid is the word for one, the one, and wahid for the number 1. But what word do we use in Arabic for the essence, the unity of the essence? Al-ahad. It's a different word. So it's all there, linguistically, mathematically, geometrically. Alhamdulillah, it's all there, if we could only understand it. And so 0 has all of these unique mathematical properties that no other number has. Because if we conceive of the world as plenitude, we'll think of ultimate reality as the void. So if we add or subtract 0 to any number, it doesn't seem to do anything. It leaves it essentially unchanged. But if we divide any number by 0, it explodes. It becomes indefinite. Not infinite in the true sense of infinite, which is indefinite in indefinite dimensions, because the line is indefinite in one dimension. So it's not the infinite as such, but it's the indefinite, because Allah can make great. But if we multiply anything by 0, it reduces it to nothing. If we compare anything to the essence of Allah, the essence of God, it reduces it to nothingness. And that's the type of faqr that Dr. Nasr was referring to earlier. So there are moral lessons that train the whole being through this kind of mathematical symbolism. But this no thing can give us everything. If we add enough zeros to our paychecks, we can all, have many more conferences like this. So numbers is ayat Allah. We've talked about 0 and 1. What about 2? And remember, 2 is for mama, baba, and mama. So the divine names of majesty, Jalal, and beauty, Jamal. That God is both absolute and infinite. His names of mercy and majesty. And that is the principle of masculinity and femininity in the human state. We are created ala suratihi, in the names and qualities of God, and therefore that reflects itself in the divine order in terms of God creating all things in pairs, azwajin. And so therefore two is Baba and Mama. And we have to recognize God's transcendence to reach His immanence. We have to recognize God's majesty in order to experience His beauty. So look at the word ordering there. Baba first, Mama second. And so the metaphysical meaning of the three, in terms of relating this, father, mother, and child. The Trinity, the product, that's a return to unity in multiplicity, and therefore harmony. There could not be any harmony without multiplicity of the parts. And so to quote Anna Maria Schimmel in her Mystery of Numbers, the triad leads to a new integration, one that does not negate the duality preceding it, but rather overcomes it, just as the child is a binding element that unites the male and female parents. And so the three related to ikhwati, the idea of child with mother and father. And so these beautiful stories, when we unpack them, bring out this remarkable metaphysical symbolism. So how does arithmetic relate to the other sciences? Well, arithmetic, as we've seen, would be number outside of time and space. It has this metaphysical symbolism to it. Geometry would be number in space, music, number in time, and then astronomy would be number in space and time. And so we have this complete, in a sense, this is what's known as the quadrivium that relates the different sciences together. But in order for us to understand the spiritual symbolism of geometry, we have to have this metaphysical symbolism of number, right? It all begins with the symbolism in arithmetic. So for example, the geometric point is the geometric analog to 0. The circle is the geometric analog to 1. It's a unity, it's a totality. And in a sense, the circle also represents inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun. We come from God through the arc of descent and return back to Him. And I owe this commentary to Dr. Awan when we were talking about this last night. And the 2 bows length, when the Prophet ﷺ came within 2 bows of Allah on the Mi'raj, if you put those 2 bows together, it generates the circle. One is the circle of descent, and then the Mi'raj, return back to Allah. So all of these principles can be integrated and expressed in this type of sacred geometry, which Keith Critchlow's and of course Emma Clark's presentation brought out so beautifully this morning. And actually, Keith Critchlow is really the person who should be here giving this presentation in that regard. But in any case, that is why arithmetic was always taught in our Turath alongside geometry. They were taught at the same time because one could understand the metaphysical symbolism of the number in arithmetic on one hand and see it qualitatively through the eye in geometry on the other. So they were wed together. They were mutually reinforcing. And we experience that same qualitative difference, that same quality in music, as we've so beautifully heard today and yesterday, and we'll hear so again this evening. That if you take a chord, for example, and pluck it, and you get the note C, if you cut the chord in half and pluck it again, you'll get the same note, C, but an octave higher. And if you double it, you'll get it an octave lower. So you can hear the quality through the ear, but it's still related to the mathematics. And in a sense, all of the great mosques and cathedrals were designed according to these ratios. What is the difference between a jet engine roaring and Beethoven's Fifth performed by the Berlin Philharmonic? And I'm quoting verbatim from Dr. Nasr on this. It's because the difference is that notes are ratios of whole small numbers, whereas the jet engine roaring is not. And so in the medieval cathedrals and mosques, based on these Pythagorean ratios, they were in a sense frozen music, which therefore creates the ambiance to retune our souls, to return us to God, as Emma Clark's presentation and Keith Critchlow's opening remarks this morning so beautifully illustrated. That our souls have fallen out of tune, so to speak, and therefore to hear music, that sacred music, based on this symbolism, retunes our soul to return us back to God. And so it's very remarkable that on one hand, those Pythagorean ratios produced the optimal acoustics. They didn't need microphones to hear the adhan or the khutbah or the sermon in these cathedrals. It produces the optimal structural stability. Domes crack if they're not based on those Pythagorean ratios. They crack much more easily. It also presents the sacred ambiance and then is visually appealing. So this kind of coincidence, this complementarity of these different orders is really an illustration of Tawheed. That all of these things come together, illustrating a common source. And so when we turn to astronomy, we've considered ayatullah in various realms, but now let's consider it above. Cosmos means order and beauty and embroidery. In a sense, it's Allah's art. Allah is al-mubdi'. And we're all familiar with this very beautiful verse in the Quran, which states, "We shall show them our portents, our signs, ayatina fil afaq wa fi anfusihim." On the horizons and within themselves, until they know that this is the truth. And so when we look at the stars, at the North Star, and we take a time-elapsed photograph overnight, this is what we see. And what does this remind us of? What can we ask our children? What would this remind us of? And the first thing that the children say are either it reminds them of the dome in the masjid, like Dr. Nash has given a beautiful commentary on Ibn Tulun's mosque in Cairo, which I had the pleasure of being with him on one trip, and illustrating how all things descend from the center of the dome. And they also think of the tawaf, circumambulating the Kaaba. And so, in a sense, illustrating Tawheed. Now, when we look at this in terms of our other planets, if we take a geocentric point of view, this is the path that Venus traces around the Earth over an 8-year cycle. It is so beautiful. And this is why Venus is known as the planet of beauty. I took a course here at GW on astronomy, which I thought was going to be interesting after taking Dr. Nasr's course on religion and science. How they managed to make astronomy a boring course is beyond me, because it was really, yani, astaghfirullah. But anyway, this is the way we should be taught astronomy, to illustrate the embroidery of Allah, the cosmos' order, beauty, embroidery. The path of Mercury is also quite beautiful. But each one of these patterns has a different personality to it, has a different quality to it, in the same way that each one of the numbers has a personality, and each one of the geometric shapes has a personality, and the music has a personality. And so we have sacred arithmetic, sacred geometry, sacred music, sacred astronomy, all integrated in this very beautiful pattern. And this, finally, is the path of Mars. And we notice some asymmetries there. And so each one of the planets has this remarkable pattern to it, and each one of them has a qualitative meaning. And we had this in our Turath. This was all in our Turath. But unfortunately, we've lost it today, and therefore we must recover this intellectual heritage, as Dr. Nasr eloquently articulated today. And so the Quran is what holds science and religion together. The Quran is al-Kitab, meaning mother, of course, origin, root, foundation, basis. And as Dr. Nasr said, although I said I wouldn't say as Dr. Nasr said all the time, but anyway, is that we have the Quran al-Tadwini, the written Quran, and al-Quran al-Takwini, the cosmos. The first revelation to Adam alayhi salam was not a book, it was the cosmos itself. But he could read that as a sacred text because he was able to penetrate his own heart. Just as the Native Americans do when they go on a vision quest, for example, into nature, to read the signs, to read nature as a sacred text. And so nature is not reducible to its quantitative dimension. But if we lose that in arithmetic, we will lose it in geometry, and we'll lose it in music, and we'll lose it in astronomy, and it will be the de-education, the de-schooling of our children. And that, unfortunately, was the type of education I think most of us receive. I mean, I went to one of the best high schools in the area here, and, you know, received a great secular education. But I had never heard there was such a thing as Islamic physics, not just Muslims who do physics, until I met Dr. Nasr. And my father was a professor here. I have to thank my father for introducing me to Dr. Nasr, because my father attended one of his lectures when he first came to the university as a university professor. There were only 5 world leaders in their fields. And so my father attended the lecture of Dr. Nasr, and I remember I was a sophomore. He came home and said, "Waleed, I've met the most brilliant scholar I've ever seen in my life. You have to take classes with him." And so that was it. Yeah, I said, "Hadr, yes, sir." And to this day, my father is yani, he thinks it's the best thing he's ever done. So alhamdulillah, barakallahu fik. And so the Quran is what holds religion and science together. And therefore, everything is an ayah. Numbers are ayahs, geometry, music, the heavens above, ourselves, everything is an ayah of God, a sign, symbol, portent. And so studying the verses of the Quran and studying nature are both studying ayatullah. There's a universe of shared discourse. Regardless, whether we know it or not, we're studying ayatullah, signs of God, vestigia. But the ayat of the Quran are on a higher level, obviously, than those of nature, or a rock, for example. And so there's a hierarchy of knowledge, and that hierarchy of knowledge is essential to preserve this harmony between religion and science. And so Dr. Nasr this morning referred to Islamic epistemology, the intellect and the goal of knowledge, all of which was profoundly important and is related to the hierarchy of the levels of consciousness in the subject that knows, and the hierarchy of levels of being in the object that is known. And it is by virtue of that correspondence that we get this hierarchy of knowledge. And so cosmology is therefore the study of the cosmos in its totality. Everything below the divine order. That's not just the visible world, but including the invisible world, the angelic and psychic realms. Cosmography, which is really what we do more today, and by the way, Muslim astronomers, as we all know, had a huge impact on that, to the extent that still over half the stars still have Arabic names, despite the efforts to purge them of their Arabic origins. But in any case, cosmography is really what we do today. And when I took that course on astronomy, it was a lot more about cosmography than it was about cosmology. And cosmogony, the science of the origin of the cosmos, of course, the kun fayakun. God says, be, and it is. And this is going to have very important implications for our understanding of later developments in quantum mechanics that we'll get to very shortly, to bring out the relevance of Islamic science for today's challenges. And so we have the divine order creating the microcosm on one hand and the macrocosm on the other, the human state and the world. And of course, the etymology of the word world, which is such a wonderful story behind that. World comes from were. You know, we've all heard of a werewolf, a man-wolf. Were old, old man. There's a correspondence between the microcosm and the macrocosm that's built into the etymology of the word world. And so, the microcosm and macrocosm are not the roots of each other. Therefore, we are theomorphic. We're made ala suratihi. And there's a correspondence between the microcosm and macrocosm, which is why we can know the cosmos. That everything out there is also within us. That we consist of body, soul, and spirit. And so the spirit within us, the intellect, is the principle of our consciousness and our being, the Spirit of God within us. It is that which illuminates. And so the analogy, the visible analogy to that would be the sun. The sun in the sky, which allows us to see on one hand, and on the other hand is what allows the plants to grow. There wouldn't be any plants without the sun. And without plants, there wouldn't be animals either. And without those two, there wouldn't be us. So in a sense, the visible sun is a symbol of the divine intellect. And so we have within us the sun. And reason, which is a lower level, which is in a sense a reflection of the intellect on the level of the soul, would be analogous to the moon reflecting the light of the sun to the earth. So our reason would be analogous to the moon. And then finally our body, analogous to the earth. So there is this correspondence. And we could walk through many other elements, but the point is that the hierarchy of body, soul, and spirit has its correspondence within the macrocosm that is brought out very beautifully in this symbolism. And so the symbolic, from the Greek symboline, is that which links levels of reality together. That Islamic cosmology is necessarily symbolic. It links these orders of reality together. Whereas the diabolic is what breaks the link between these levels of reality, and therefore symbolism is a language of religion, of ayatollah. And so it's not a coincidence that we have the Quran referring to, for example, 7 stages of creation and 7 heavens, and we have the 7 visible planets and the 7 days of the week and the 7 notes on the musical scale and the 7 tawaf and the 7 sa'i and so forth. That 7, although we didn't have a chance to walk through the symbolism of all the numbers, 7 has its own symbolism. And so this is what would have been taught to our children if we taught them according to our Torah. And then they could integrate all of these different orders together, which would be a very profound experience of Tawheed. And so, as Dr. Nasr says very beautifully in his Science and Civilization in Islam, the aim of all the Islamic sciences is to show the unity and interrelatedness of all that exists, so that in contemplating the unity of the cosmos, man may be led to the unity of the divine principle, of which the unity of nature is the image. And so I want to relate this discussion to the perennial philosophy very briefly and to the science of other civilizations. That how does the genesis of Islamic science relate to the perennial philosophy, which is the theme of this conference? And to understand that, obviously, Islam appears in the full light of history in the 7th century, and all of the scientific traditions of other civilizations have already been quite developed by this time. Islam expands very rapidly where these traditions have been active. And there wasn't that much pre-Islamic science in Arabia, although there was some observational astronomy, and they have hundreds of different names for types of winds and moonlight and so forth. But in all of this, the Muslims were very anxious to integrate that knowledge. Why? Because the Shahada is a statement about the nature of reality. La ilaha illallah. That God is the source of all truth and knowledge, and knowledge has a soteriological function in Islam. As the Prophet ﷺ said, "Qul la ilaha illallah wa tuflihu." Say, La ilaha illallah, there's nothing worthy of worship except God, and be saved. Not just mentally say it, but really take that into our heart and draw the full consequences of it. And so that has a saving function. And because Islam considers itself to be the last of the religions in this cycle of human existence, it had to incorporate the sciences and philosophy of these pre-Islamic civilizations. That anything that conformed to Tawheed was considered serious knowledge by the Muslims and therefore worthy of translation. And so, as has been referred to earlier, that the Islamic view of pre-Islamic revelations is that everything is originally based on Tawheed, that every science and philosophy which confirmed the unity of the Creator was Islamic in the deepest sense, and therefore the Prophet ﷺ said, seek knowledge even unto China, which is the farthest that we could go. And therefore, Islam's providential function was to integrate all serious science and philosophy from pre-Islamic civilizations consistent with Tawheed. And therefore, any form of knowledge was determined not by its language or cultural origins, but by its metaphysical context and direction. And then we have this wonderful graph from Dr. Nasr's Islamic Science and Illustrated Study, in which he illustrates how all of these different sciences and philosophies were integrated into an Islamic context, and how that was brought to actually the West. We don't have time to go into this now very much, but when you look on the map, this is also from the opening cover of the hardback edition of Dr. Nasr's Science. When we look at the map, we see Athens right next to Italy. I mean, we see Greece right next to Italy, so Athens, why didn't Aristotle just, kind of, and Plato go all the way to Rome very quickly? But that was not the case. The only book of Plato, and only partially, that went to the West was Plato's Timaeus, not even his Republic. And none of Aristotle got to the West. It first went to Athens, went from Athens to Alexandria as the museum that Dr. Nasr referred to earlier this morning in the 3rd century BC. Ultimately, through, I should just refer you to his text, it gets to Jundeshapur, which becomes the great center of learning in the Persian Empire in the 3rd century AD. Ultimately, all of these forms of knowledge come to Baghdad in the 8th century, the Beit al-Hikmah with the translation movement, and then finally that comes to Cordoba in the 11th century, and all of these sciences get transmitted to the West in the 11th century AD, which sets off a huge sea change in medieval science and has remarkable implications. Now, what happens after this is that, unfortunately, mysticism becomes eclipsed in the West with the rise of nominalism and the denial of our ability to know the essences of things, which leads to the denial of symbolism in science, and everything, in a sense, becomes lost after that. And so the qualitative dimension of the quadrivium is really lost. And therefore, we get on a railroad track that rather than having knowledge becoming integrated, when we have both the qualitative and quantitative dimension of the quadrivium, with only the quantitative dimension, knowledge becomes fragmented and compartmentalized. And so we talk a lot about liberal arts universities today. We're not teaching the liberal arts. This is not a knowledge that liberates. It's a very fragmented understanding. It's only a quantitative understanding. It's liberal arts in name, but not in substance, unfortunately. And so, fortunately, in the modern context, quantum mechanics has eliminated this type of reductionist approach to science in the modern West. That the typical view that we're taught in high school of these kind of billiard ball particles being out there and so forth actually don't exist. The particle from T1 to T2 seems to hop in and out of existence, which is why sometimes physicists say, well, it goes from this universe to another universe, which is, of course, absurd. I mean, we're never going to observe that. But they're making all of these ad hoc assumptions in order to avoid a deeper engagement, philosophical engagement with religion. From the Islamic perspective, it's very simple that Allah is not only the creator, but the sustainer of the world. At each instant, Allah is recreating the universe. And so this rejection of this reductionist approach that we have matter as the building blocks. There is no matter. In the beginning was consciousness, a famous essay by Dr. Nasr, in which quantum paradox actually illustrates the primacy of consciousness, that it is Allah's consciousness, that Allah is al-Musawwir, the giver of forms, is what actualizes the world at each instant. Allah is pure actuality. There is no potentiality. Otherwise, there would be a change in the divine nature, which is impossible. And so Allah is pure actuality. This world is potentiality, is possibility. And only that which is actual can actualize the potential. And so Allah must be recreating the world at every instant. And that's the solution to quantum paradox on one hand, and integrating the findings of physics into higher orders of knowledge on the other. And that has profound implications for Darwinian evolution, that Darwinian evolution was very much a product of this reductionist view of the application of Newtonian mechanics to biology, that you have dead matter and life is an accident of dead matter and consciousness is an accident upon life. Quantum mechanics reverses this completely. And so to use another analogy, that if we're body, soul, and spirit, how then do we explain our origins, the form of things? That the spirit is the principle of the soul, which is the principle of the body. Death is a supernatural event. It's not a natural event, which is why the angel of death has to come. Once our soul leaves our body falls apart. So it's our soul that integrates our body. We could not have a body without having a soul. And in the same way, what integrates the soul is the spirit. You know, we'll talk about somebody being scatterbrained. So, and that's symbolized in the symbol of the American Medical Association. If only our medical school would teach that, that would be a good thing. That you have the rod of Moses symbolizing the spirit, which is immutable, and the snake, the soul, which is always in a state of change. But once the soul is integrated around the spirit, we have both psychological and physical health. And so that very beautiful symbolism brings out this hierarchy. So we must have the spirit in order to have the soul, in order to have the body. It's vertical causality. And so the analogy that Dr. Noss made so beautifully is the imagery of ice, water, and vapor. Ice for the body, water for the soul, vapor for the spirit, on those levels of reality. And so we have the divine descent. So if we have the vertical causality in physics, with God recreating the world at every instance in physics, we must have the same vertical causality in biology, which is a total refutation of Darwinian evolution. And so, when it comes to Tawheed and the classification of sciences, we need to integrate the findings of modern science into higher orders of knowledge. And so Aristotle, of course, was the first teacher, not because he didn't have a teacher who was Plato, whose teacher was Aristotle, but because he was the first to classify the sciences and show their interrelationships, which for Islam is an especially important function, because being based on Tawheed, the interrelations and interconnections between the sciences are absolutely essential. And so Aristotle being the first teacher, Al-Farabi being the second teacher, because he was the first to take those pre-Islamic sciences and relate those to the Islamic sciences in an organized classification. Mir Damad is the third teacher, because he was the first to do that in the Shiite context. We now today need a fourth teacher who can integrate the findings of modern science into higher orders of knowledge. I think you all know who that is. Dr. Nasser is the fourth teacher. And so I'll just conclude with recommended reading. Science and Civilization, Islam, Islamic Science and Illustrated Study. And that we need really to bring what Dr. Nasser is teaching at the university level down to the elementary school. Because it is literally, if our children from day one are being taught only the quantitative dimension of arithmetic and geometry and so forth and so on, it leads to a catastrophic end, which we see in all the intellectual pollution and environmental pollution and spiritual crisis and forms of escapism in our world today. Barakallahu fikum. Thank you very much.